spring and summer.
All right, welcome back to Talking Capitalism. Today we are talking with Dr. Isaac Saney, who is an associate professor and director of the Black and African Diaspora Studies program at Dalhousie University, our only guest who's actually from Dalhousie University. So an extra special welcome to this prolific scholar and community organizer who I think it's fair saying works representatively in the radical Black Caribbean tradition, from which, we both come from Trinidad and Tobago originally, but Isaac is a dedicated internationalist, as I'm sure we'll hear about. He, aside from the many articles and reviews and administration work that Isaac has done, he has two wonderful books, one called Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, and the more recent one, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return, with the exclamation mark intact. So a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Saney. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast, and I hope I will do it justice.
Our first question is, how did you come to understand capitalism in your life and work?
I think obviously the beginning of my political consciousness and therefore my understanding of capitalism, in a sense, begins in Trinidad and Tobago. As a student at Naparima College, I remember when I was very young, when I first joined the college, there was a lot of political activity in Trinidad, a lot of radical political activity, in which Trinidad and Tobago was part of what we could say the global third world revolution, right? Or part of that took place in the 60s and the 70s. People are familiar with the history of Trinidad and Tobago, probably are familiar in 1970, which is often characterized as the February Revolution or the Black Power Revolution, which I think is a mischaracterization simply because it was driven by working class people. But of course, race was a central aspect of it. And anyone who understands the history of Trinidad and Tobago understands how the colonial powers tried to pit, Africans against East Indians, working class Africans against working class East Indians, them occupying different, more or less geographical areas at that time in the country. So out of that comes a fervor with the failure of that uprising, right? Okay. And some of what we would say the window dressing and cosmetic concessions by the government, a number of radical political groups emerge, right? So many of them, and engage in very deep political analysis, not only of Trinidad and Tobago, its social and economic, shall we say, woes, but also placing everything in the context on an international scale. Now, as I said, as a young boy in Trinidad and Tobago, there was a person who was very connected to one of these radical political organizations, right? And who would give a lecture. And I remember it distinctly and vividly. And he always would give this lecture, right? Lunchtime, sometimes at the recess in the morning, right? And he'd talk about political events in Trinidad and Tobago and international episodes as well. And he'd give this lecture and always link it back to a radical analysis that at the root of the cause is capitalism and, of course, imperialism. And he'd stare at me and he'd say, Saney, you may not understand this now, but when you get older, you will, right? So in a sense, that was an introduction to that analysis. My father also working for one of the oil companies as a medical officer, had a very, very good relationship with Oil Field Workers Trade Union. And so I got a sense, of how, if one did not, shall we say, assert the rights of workers, the rights of ordinary people, the existing economic system would run roughshod over those, right? So those, shall we say, needs of these people were satisfied, obviously, through people deliberately trying to satisfy those needs. So this is obviously me trying to understand it as a young person, rather than the system itself automatically and by its very nature addressing those needs. And of course, the issue of struggle, labor, the militant labor movement in Trinidad and Tobago. So I was aware of that then. And of course, within this, because Trinidad was also dominated by various multinational corporations, particularly US corporations at that time, you got the sense very dimly as a young person, as a child, right, of the imbalance between richer and poorer nations, that somehow power was concentrated in the north and countries such as us in the south, right? Okay. And we could say the non-white world always found themselves in a position of inequality and subordination. Now, when I came to study in Canada, half my roots lie in Nova Scotia, in the Black community in Nova Scotia, and some of it in the Indigenous community. When I came here to study, I became politically active, right? So I had a dim sense then, and it's here where I sort of operationalize these ideas, particularly in the anti-war movement and the anti-racist movement. And in the context of that, and people who live in Halifax know, may be surprised to learn that in the late 80s and early 90s, right, Halifax was fervent of political discussion and political actions, from people talking about capitalism and workers' rights and how people could build a socialist movement, an alternative to a system that put profits above human need, to also looking at international issues. So people were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. People were involved at the time of what was going on in Central America, the danger of U.S. intervention in Central America. And then we had, huge conferences on the Caribbean, huge conferences on Africa, right? Particularly around the, dealing with the fight against apartheid. This is in the late 80s, early 90s. But also, we had the largest academic conference that's ever been held on Cuba that was held here, and so that brought the idea of not only the discussion of anti-capitalist ideas, but specifically more positively of socialism, right? So I was introduced to these ideas and people tried to interconnect them here, right? Why do we have such tremendous inequalities? So I did a lot of took a lot of international development studies courses. I worked very closely with Henry Weltmeyer, who is a renowned Latin Americanist and a renowned Marxist political economist, right? And I worked also with people like Rocky Jones and other people in the Black community. So what did that introduced me to the fact that capitalism, by its very nature, generates inequalities, oppression, disenfranchisement, and marginalizations within Canada, okay, but also on an international scope. That its very nature does that, right? And of course, one of the most important points, it demonstrated to me how race and class, and of course gender, interact, but particularly race and class interact, and in many cases, race is class is race for the vast majority of the world.
Thank you for that. I mean, that actually dovetails very nicely into the selection from Marx that you chose for us out of chapter 31. Maybe you could spend some time telling us more about why you think this chapter is so significant.
Yeah, I think one of the big gaps, in how leftists operate, right? I mean, let's put it in, and you and I have had this discussion many times. The Western left dominates the discourse, right? Okay. And I often say that even when they're in the most well-meaning mode, right? They always, the idea is to the rest of the world, i.e. the global South, we support your right for self-determination so long as you self-determine in the way we wish you to self-determine, right? And within this, become very crass class reductionist, right? And the centrality of race, right? And racism to capitalism's development, right? Okay. We can argue people can argue whether theoretically it's necessary. There are arguments about that, but historically that's the way it emerged. And there's in fact an argument that when people talk about the emergence of capitalism, right? They often talk, well, it emerges, there are arguments like Weber about the Protestant ethic. Obviously, we put that aside, there are Marxists who talk about, the enclosures and so forth. And so it's like it, in a sense, emerged because of endogenous conditions in Western Europe, right? Nothing to do with the dispossession, right, of the indigenous peoples and the genocide, the plunder of silver and gold. And then on top of that, the Industrial Revolution has nothing to do with the transatlantic slave trade, the transatlantic slave system, and the kidnapping, dehumanization, and brutalization of Africans, right, in the plantations. And we know from the stats that it played a central role. So when we look at Marx and we read that phrase, Marx, in a sense, is perhaps laying the basis, right, for the first articulations of the idea, what people refer to as racial capitalism, right? I dislike the term racial capitalism because it's assumed there's a legitimate and orthodox study of capitalism on this side, and racial capitalism is sort of this hobby project of people who are on the fringe, right? There are debates, where racial capitalism is reduced to people who argue, well, there were, pre-capitalist formations and inchoate racist ideas, and people debate that preceded the development of capitalism. Then people talk about, well, it's an argument over the relationship of slavery to the development of capitalism, and then there's arguments, well, whether it's, racism is logically necessary for capitalism development, or is it historically contingent? I think that misses the point. We live in the here and now. And it's clear that racism and the subjugation of the global South, okay, and particularly Africa, right? Okay, is essential to the development of capitalism. And in fact, there's a theorist who's an incredible political activist, Omali Yeshitali. You don't have to agree with everything he says, but he is the chairman of the African People's Socialist Party. But and he's seen as an activist, he's seen as a Black nationalist, but he's an internationalist, right? And you may disagree with some of his positions, but he makes the point that the enclosure of the commons, which people see as being so central for the development of capitalism, right? When all of a sudden we have the commons being appropriated by, the elite, right? Okay, the ruling circles, the emerging capitalist class, so alienating people from the land, so they then have to stream from the countryside in a sense to become wage laborers in the cities, right? The stage that's set for that is actually the beginning of the plunder of the Americas, and then of course the development of transatlantic slave trade, right? So I think one of the things about that is it really centers the experience of the vast number of people, right? I read a lot of stuff by Western Marxists, right? And the only thinkers who matter, or the only thinkers they consider to be of significance, are overwhelmingly located either in the North and therefore of a Eurocentric persuasion, or are people in the South who basically, in a sense, parrot those ideas, right? So in a sense, how can you write not only a narrative, but also how can you prescribe, solutions, right? These prescriptions without taking into consideration the experience of the mass of global South. So I think that's what that does. It centralizes how one what happens in the Americas, what happens in the Caribbean through the massive exploitation of enslaved Africans because labor, and of course we cannot forget the plunder of India, the Bengal plunder, and so forth. And Marx really begins to articulate that without this, and that's what he says clearly, without Europe's expansion, and conquest in a sense, right, and domination of the rest of the world outside of Europe, they would not, the implication is there would not have been capitalism, right? Okay, at least Europe wouldn't have risen to the dominance on the world stage. And I think that's critically important point. Another point I'd like to make as well is people also tend not to read Marx's ethnological notebooks, where Marx at the end of his life is, really, shall we say, rethinking many of these concepts. He's not a class reductionist. He's not an economic determinist, right? He is very nuanced. And if you read some of his letters he's writing, right, back and forth, even if you're reading some of his political comments, right, like Civil War in France and so forth, he's very nuanced in some of these analyses, right? Okay. And he provides a basis for a lot of this discussion. I'll also like to point out too, that when we read Marx in English, right, and this was introduced to me by a Cuban scholar who learned to master both German, and of course he reads French, and he also reads Russian, so he could read Lenin in Russian. When you read Marx in some of the non-English, like in the French version, right, Marx says some very subtly different things, right? Okay, and in many cases overturns this idea that the global South is looking to the North for its path to true quote-unquote development that will expand the envelope of human creativity in all the ways that it should be, right? He really is questioning that kind of determinism and so forth. So what I think Marx provides in that, in that very powerful and succinct paragraph is the beginnings of an analysis that places, racism as central to how capitalism has developed and central to how it functions, right? And it also does two things. It in a sense, challenges the class reductionist, who reduce racism to an epiphenomenon and therefore a simple byproduct, but it also challenges the race essentialists, okay, who also deny the centrality of understanding class and the material conditions in which the economy and social conditions are produced and reproduced and so forth, right? So the end of point I'd say is that what it really centers is that in this question here, the defeat of racism, the defeat of white supremacy becomes essential to actually transforming capitalism and so on. So I am a member also of the Global African Congress. I'm a member of the International Steering Group, and that's the major civil society body that's involved in pushing the reparations movement forward. So some people may be aware that the Caribbean community the CARICOM, which is made up of 15 countries from the former English colonies, what we sometimes refer to perhaps as the English-speaking Caribbean, okay, have launched a lawsuit, right, against former European colonial powers for indigenous genocide and for the transatlantic slave trade. This is part of the reparations movement. So Hilary Biddles, who's the vice chancellor of the University of West Indies, calls this, he says, in his historical chronology and historiography, he calls it we're in the fifth movement of the reparations movement. What's exciting about this is it's not about primarily about money, right? It's about transforming social relations and understanding that reparations will make a contribution to transforming social relations within countries and also relations between countries, right? And in a sense, redress for what's happened, indigenous liberation, Black liberation, global South liberation, right, is essential for, in a sense, creating a world fit for humanity. I know many people will know that we live under the sword of the ecological catastrophe, right? And it's interesting that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its 2022 report, for the first time acknowledged that colonialism, the dispossession of indigenous people, the transatlantic slave trade, set the stage for much of the climate change, right? It is devastating humanity because the fact is that we can talk about the wealth made of enslaved Africans. We can talk about the incredible brutalization. We can talk about, obviously, of the resistance of enslaved Africans who waged a constant war for the liberation, right? But we can also talk about that there was a significant impact on the environment driven by these economic imperatives to clear land, to make plantations and so forth, right? They do a whole number of different things that, in a sense, have created these conditions, right? That have led to the ecological catastrophe we face. And at the end of the day, the people who are going to suffer the most are the people who have been the most colonized.
Right.
Are the people who have the least resources, both within the global north and outside of it.
Thank you for that. That was absolutely wonderful. We have just one question left, and that is, it's at least possible that students will not retain everything that they learn in this first year history class. So if there was one thing that you think they should take with them across their various disciplines and many trajectories of their life that to remember about capitalism and the study of capitalism, what should students keep in mind?
Well, I only think of it in the terms that young people face a tremendous challenge. It's an existential moment through which we're living through. I've mentioned the ecological disaster. There's a massive socio-economic inequalities, both class and racial inequalities that exist throughout the world. There's the danger of global war. We see the global conflagration. We see all of these different things. I say that the history of capitalism has shown that nothing is positively gained for humanity but through struggle.
Right.
Okay. And Rocky Jones, who was so prominent in the struggle here in Nova Scotia, not just for African Nova Scotian rights and freedom, but for, he was involved in broader struggles for the society and internationally as well, said freedom is a constant struggle. And Kwame Ture, who was formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, another Trinidadian, if I might add, right, said organize, 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 right? So I think it's important that capitalism is international in its scope, with its divisions that lead to these imperial conflicts. So we have to transform the system both within our countries, but internationally. But at the end of the day, it will come through our struggles, right? It will come through our, constant struggle for freedom and human dignity and liberation. Marx, used to, Marx, the two things I'll end with Marx. Marx often said, people make history, but not under the conditions that they choose, but under conditions that are inherited from the past, right? So that's a rough paraphrase. So in a sense, yes, we have to struggle in the conditions we have, but we make our own history. And then his famous quote is, philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, right? And I think that's where we're at. We have to change the world, or perhaps humanity, and all life on this planet is in danger.
Dr. Saney, we have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for this intellectual roller coaster. We are very appreciative of it. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for having this wonderful podcast.